So for our final remarks this afternoon, we're going to hear from Aubrey Streit Krug and Omar Tesdell. And I'll just tell you a little bit about both of them before we get started. Aubrey Streit Krug is an environmental humanist and director of ecosphere studies at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas, focused on relationships between humans and plants. And she holds a PhD in English and Great Plains Studies from the University of Nebraska and is a student of the Omaha language, which is an indigenous language from the U.S. Midwest. Omar Tesdell is assistant professor of geography at Birzeit University in Palestine, where he studies landscape and agroecological transformation in the Middle East and also in the Americas. And he recently authored the first guide to Palestinian wild food plants. And he holds a PhD in geography from the University of Minnesota. So they are giving a presentation in conversation on a social perennial vision. So take it away, Aubrey and Omar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liz. And thank you all for being here with us today. We would especially like to thank all the conference organizers and acknowledge the land in which we're gathered. Our questions. If the ecological future of agriculture is to be perennial and diverse, what is required of us in social terms? What do we need to try to understand to make a truly just and sustainable society?
These questions and our reflections on them have been shaped by the particular land communities in which we live and study. The rocky wadis and hillsides of Palestine, the grasslands of the North American Great Plains, and we are, of course, indebted to many teachers and colleagues who help us in this process, and I would argue including the landscape itself. The two of us collaborate on research and education through the Land Institute's Ecospheric Studies program, where we will take turns speaking during this presentation. And while we'll try to contribute different forms of knowledge and perspectives, the words and ideas that we're going to share were actually written together in a kind of collaborative way. So we want to present this as a kind of collaborative social perennial vision.
Agriculture is not merely an environmental problem, by which we mean it's not merely out there in fields that surround us but are separate from us. Agriculture is a system that has emerged from and within the processes of the ecosphere. The ecosphere can be understood as the creative and destructive and very dynamic mantle of life on this sun-fed planet in the Milky Way. It is the critical zone or the creative nexus of the airs and waters and rocks and creatures who only together with light make life. An ecospheric perspective helps us conceive of how agriculture isn't just out there, it's in here, it's among us. Agriculture shapes us, and you can't see that picture. It's a good one. Can we go back? That one works. What about this one? No. What about the next one?
HDMI port?
I'm not sure.
It's saying HDMI.
You're going to really test our powers of description and vocabulary if we have to describe each one of these beautiful images to you.
Just disappeared.
Okay. All right. At long last, here's the photo you are going to see, which is an illustration of how agriculture is ingrained in us socially and culturally from a very young age. This is my 5-year-old son farming the rocks in the backyard and coming home with pictures of wheat that he is thinking about and identifying with already. So how we humans feed ourselves is how, for better and for worse, we embody our relationship to the ecosphere we're embedded within. And that includes our social relationships to other human beings and communities. Scholars in the social sciences and humanities have theorized multiple ways of understanding and naming these dominant logics that together drive what is now a petro-agriculture, keeping humans on the same eroding path. So here's the next image that you got to see already. I just want to name some of these terms that are used to describe some of these dominant logics. The first one is agrologistics. This comes from the work of Timothy Morton, a philosopher. Agrologistics is a mechanical and viral program which pulls humans into an ever-tightening loop of carbon extraction. There's also a concept coming out of philosophy from the feminist philosopher Kate Mann about the logic of misogyny, the system that reinforces, upholds, and enforces patriarchy, and that's logically dependent upon the reasoning that the humanity of some humans, women, is contingent upon them primarily giving their time and bodies and attention to the moral support and needs of other humans, primarily men. There are settler colonial logics. This is coming from the work of Lloyd and Wolfe. Logics that destroy in order to replace, that justify domination of the land by claiming they're going to put it to more valuable use. Such systems include the logic of elimination, the idea that what pre-exist people on the land must be eliminated in order to allow for that proper use, and the racist logic of deficiency. This is coming from the work of scholar Frank Hay, the belief that what newcomers find existing in a place, like this mixed grass prairie, is inherently deficient and in need of efficient improvement and replacement. The more we struggle to directly confront these seemingly all-encompassing agricultural logics, the more that we might inadvertently reinforce them and reify them as all-encompassing perceptions of reality. And meanwhile, social and ecological harm to the ecosphere continues. These dominant logics that have grown out of the history of agriculture over at least the last 10,000 years, and that shape our economic and energetic relationships to the land and each other, are incompatible with the health of the ecosphere.
As a geographical case study, consider the landscape of Palestine. Since its emergence millions of years ago from the ocean, it was covered with dense forests of oak and terebinth trees. As humans emerged and moved through the area, those forests and associated plant groups became the supermarket of wild grasses, legumes, and other plants that early Neolithic peoples domesticated into crops. It probably would have looked something like this photograph, which I took about a week ago. The dominant, and by extension, it's being argued more and more, Neolithic peoples in turn domesticated humans. This is the cave in what is now near the village of Shukba, where some of the earliest physical archaeological evidence of plant domestication took place. The pioneering British archaeologist Dorothy Garrett excavated it in the 1920s and 30s and named the entire culture, which stretches through the Levant for this valley, which is called the Natufian culture, which many of you are probably familiar with. The gentle climate with its moderate sea-based weather and abundant sunshine and rain has been a comfortable locale for us humans to inhabit. In Palestine are the remains of the longest inhabited human settlements in the world. This is probably one of the oldest fields in the world because it hosted some of the first experiments with domestication of plants. This is probably one of the oldest human settlements in the world. This is Tel al-Sultan in what is now the city of Jericho, which is the longest continuously inhabited, probably one of the longest continuously inhabited places in the world. And some of those mud brick walls are dating from the pre-pottery period. So, however, the first human experiments with organized belief practices in major religions also emerged from this landscape, and I don't think that it's a coincidence. Annual plow-based grain production has brought deep wounds into the soils built by the ancient forests of Palestine. Wheat and barley, with the attendant legumes of lentil, chickpea, vetch, provide short-term gains in the within a tillage system. A complex of perennial tree crops do remain, however, including olive, grape, and almond. Combined with the domestication of grazing animals like sheep and goats, the landscape of Palestine has provided food, fuel, fiber for many, many generations of human communities who took those technologies and ideas and plants around the globe. However, this provision has come at a great cost. Anthropogenic climate change must be considered not just from the view of the global north, but from the perspective of the marginalized spaces of the world. And I think that this resonates with our conversation in the last panel. It will be places like Palestine, subject to pressure from occupation, which will bear the brunt as fossil fuels become scarce. Climate change adaptation is particularly difficult for people living in a deeply contested land where most aspects of life and research, including borders and travel, are monopolized by a powerful state. Our food system is untenable and unsustainable in Palestine, and what remains of our meager political and economic system is also on the verge of collapse. We find ourselves nearly entirely dependent upon and dominated by an occupying army. Inequality and injustice, much like many parts of the world, burden Palestine and us all. And the land that gave forth to lentil, chickpea, wheat, barley, and sheep now imports almost all of those things from other places. Palestinians seek to live in one of the oldest agricultural landscapes in the world, one that bears the scars of millennia of plowing and annual grain-based agriculture. Palestinians live in the ruins of the myriad societies that came and went, and the future of our common home on earth is in question. Our situation in Palestine leaves us largely unable to face that future. We seek to change landscapes in my research group to allow perennial polycultures to build justice within human societies. We've outlined dominant agricultural logics and briefly analyzed their historical and geographic impacts on the ecosphere in order to emphasize our need for human community to transform those landscapes. So here's my proposition, or our proposition. If annual plow-based agriculture has provided an ecological, economic, and energetic infrastructure for the development of human society, then may we assume the reverse can also be true. In other words, that a perennial and diverse agriculture can provide the ecological, economic, and energetic infrastructure for the development of a new human society, and new human societies. Different agricultural structures certainly influence the shape of communities, and perennial grains grown in mixtures can and will be shapers of human community. But new crops will be only one of many variables and forces. Our work on perennials is important, but we cannot rest assured that perennial grains grown in mixtures will necessarily, in and of themselves, deterministically bring about truly and just sustainable futures. The scientific research necessary to accomplish this goal of diverse perennial agricultures is not simply a precursor to building human communities who will feed themselves via such agroecosystems. Ecology and society interact. This is a photograph of Aubrey and Brandon and members of my family and research team and colleagues on a trip in January to collect wild food plants with a local expert who was the main source for our guide to wild food plants. She's the older woman on the upper right. Her name is Amne. Ecology and society interact. Nature and culture are not separate. Humans are land animals who live in relationship with biophysical and ecological processes, and humans are social creatures who live in relationship to each other. Transforming agriculture requires attention to and perception of both. The technical research required to carry out build perennial polycultures and social research required to build new cultural institutions are dimensions of the same process. A social vision of perennialization and diversification is required in this research community. And the Land Institute's ecospheric mission affirms this sensible truth of the interrelationship. When people, land, and community are as one, all three members prosper. When they relate not as members, but as competing interests, all three are exploited. By consulting nature as the source and measure of that membership, the Land Institute seeks to develop an agriculture that will save soil from being lost or poisoned, while promoting community life at once prosperous and enduring. So community is more of a question than an answer, and making human community arrangements and social relationships with diverse perennial agroecosystems that do not simply replicate the dominant agricultural logics we have developed may be novel, but it is hardly inevitable.
It's hard and hardly inevitable.
Yes.
So to consider this question of community, restoration ecologist William Jordan outlines what he identifies as the problem of community. So this is from his 2003 book, The Sunflower Forest. And I'm going to read a passage. Jordan writes, "There are psychological, social, and biological barriers around a community, and crossing them is neither easy nor natural, but it is difficult and involves hard emotional work. People do not, for the most part, carry out this work on their own, but in the context of cultural institutions, which provide the tools, techniques, and to some extent even the incentive people need to confront the difficulties involved and deal with them in a productive way. Community may be a great, even irreducible value, but like other values and virtues, it is not the solution of a problem, but is rather the problem itself. Of course, community is a good thing. The problem is, how is it achieved and maintained?" So that's Jordan's question to us. How is community achieved and maintained? And I think some metaphorical images are part of how humans have tried to understand and thus maintain community and culture. So a classic model for this, for the model of culture, is the iceberg model. This goes back to the year I was born, 1984. And the iceberg model is about the kind of out of awareness, taken for granted aspects of our communities that actually shape our behavior. These underlying agricultural logics and values and assumptions explain why so many of us have learned to name our perception of a freshly plowed landscape as beautiful, even without realizing it. And they explain why it takes work and effort to unlearn such a seemingly natural perception of beauty. Another conceptual metaphor for culture is the seed. This is a seed from Palestine. It's a medicago orbicularis, I think, if I said it right. Culture adaptively develops out of particular places, but it can then be carried and shared and traded and reproduced beyond those original places. It can be decontextualized. Cultures persist even as those contexts and places change. This explains why we must study how the agricultures that currently feed us have shaped our ways of seeing and thinking and feeling and knowing. That is how they've shaped and continue to shape the very cultural tools and institutions we're left still holding on to and using to try and make something new. We're still living in cultures that are adapted out of places that may no longer be here, and we can't get outside of those cultures, so we have to recognize where and what we're working with, even as we're trying to make that new. In their paper in Global Sustainability that provides the title of this conference, Tim Cruz, Wim Carton, and Leonard Olson call for strategic understanding and radical imagination of the human dimensions of perennial agriculture. They, in particular, identify the need for research that, quote, takes on the interlinked socioeconomic and ecological dimensions to help inform the policies and the socioeconomic organization of agriculture, as well as the need for more research on the process of transition itself, the ingrained practices and institutions that have a political and economic stake in perpetuating the current agricultural mode and how they can be confronted. So we're hearing about this in the last discussion as well. In addition to the work of plant breeding and ecology, the work necessary to bring perennial grain agriculture into reality involves research across a range of areas. just to name a few of the most obvious examples of knowledge that must be applied and put into action. Knowledge around automation and mechanization, ethnography, food policy, food rituals, land access, local and indigenous plant knowledge, intellectual property, supply chain management. All of this and much more can be brought to bear upon the decisions that are already being made and the even more difficult decisions to come about the knowledge and the strategies required for domesticating, tending, commercializing, and eating these new crop plants that are in process. As we look ahead, I think that we need the arts, we need history, we need memory to shape our field of sight. And we need this art narrative to actually help us see with new eyes. So I want to talk about a particular image, an illustration from the grasslands. This is the Great Vision of Ogallala Lakota Elder Heihakasapa, which was interpreted by John G. Neihart in that now canonical 1932 book, Black Elk Speaks. The Great Vision, an epic vision of a people's peace and joy and grief and strife and hope for a future. The Great Vision comes as an unbidden gift to Black Elk when he is just a child. Rustling at the center of this vision is one of the standing peoples, the cottonwood tree. So Black Elk's friend Standing Bear depicted him here under this perennial tree of life, humbled by the gift that he has received. The sacred tree is one of many gifts, including the gift of the Great Vision itself, which comes with heavy responsibility to and with the community. You can see the other grandfathers giving other gifts in the four corners, and you can see at the bottom left the representatives of the future generations approaching with their hands outstretched. This vision to Black Elk came at a time of incredible violence, just at the cusp of that violence, mere years before the events of Wounded Knee and other events irreversibly changed this particular community's way of life, before they knew how or if they were going to be able to persist through such change. The vision is about the violence, it's about the paths that present themselves, and it's about the gifts that are given in the form of plants. Black Elk Speaks tells and remembers Lakota history and futurity through Black Elk as he struggles to do what's required of him in social terms, which is to embody the vision. His vision is about these gifts needed to remake the world without knowing the outcome of such work, or if it's even possible. So this idea that cosmological visions must be performed on Earth is based in part in the belief that any type of spiritual or ethical balance must be enacted materially. I think a social perennial vision for us now invites us to place diverse perennial grains at the center of ritualized epic social movement. There, they may stand as an example of what is both possible and necessary, and we may stand under them, receiving their gifts and therefore bound to them by responsibility. A social perennial vision invites us to perform that work of possibility that needs to be performed, no more and no less. Literally, we know there is already movement happening across our home planet in the form of upheaval. Soils continue to slip away, the ground is fracked and mined, waters are rising and depleting, humans and other animals are fleeing. A social perennial vision also calls for bodies in motion. But in this vision of food justice, climate justice, ecospheric justice, we are moving toward more than away. We are moving not toward merely temporary safety, we're moving toward durable solidarity. We're moving, in other words, back toward the ground, not just out of obedience, but with a sense of homecoming and with our fellow creatures. We are in motion to try and perform a vision on Earth and to materially enact that ethical balance. Our responsibility as a community is to take radical steps toward righting our relationship with this ecosphere.
The landscape is an appropriate scale of intervention. At once broad and specific, the landscape scale provides the best opportunities for regeneration of our food production and human communities with diverse and perennial practices. Furthermore, we submit that the landscape most harmed by agricultural logics can be the sites of radical change, and that they are the places where the stakes are the highest. and they might offer the most insights. The cracks and the shadows of the landscape, lands that include human beings, may help us learn to make enduring habitats in the ecosphere. When it comes to energetic transformation, it seems logical to look to who has already been engaged in the experimental struggle to figure out how to live together within ecological limits without exploiting human labor. In other words, to study as best and as fast as we can the lessons from the past and current human attempts to live in good communities. Perhaps our line of thinking still sounds more ethical and emotional than purely rational, yet embodied collective emotions and ethics may have the potential to undermine dominant agricultural logic. We might even suggest that the increasing anger, anxiety, despair, frustration, and grief that many people are experiencing in response to ecospheric harm are sensible signals of our enduring interconnection to the land and to each other. Humans are and remain terrestrials. We are of Earth. We emerge from it, and it provides us a common home. We have achieved great successes at great cost to this common home. Today, we stand at a crossroads. Will we work to embody our potential and build new ways to inhabit Earth? Or will we continue on a risky and ultimately self-destructive journey? The wild cousins of famous annual fodder crops and many other spring annual legumes thrive in the rocky wadis and hillsides in Palestine today. This is a wild chickpea, Caesar judaicum. Our team is working to collect and identify and conserve and propagate them. We're doing the same for the hundreds of other species that were not domesticated, still wild, which people in Palestine still continue to use as supplemental foods, especially in the rainy season months when stores from the previous harvest run thin. We would argue that we're going to be needing this knowledge and these genes very soon with climate change. So we put together a guide. It's only 25 plants. We're hoping to do more. We self-published it last year in Arabic and English. And we're hoping to do more of this kind of work. I work with Yusra and Mary here on this research. That's me. And currently we have 78 accessions from this season of some of these useful plants. It's a very small collection, but we are working to build it up and build what is probably going to be the first Palestinian gene bank of these crops. The technical knowledge about the Palestinian landscape and its various beings, including the soils and geologic formations, is found also in many sources. Palestine is one of the most studied pieces of land in the world. We are collecting this knowledge and making this research accessible and effective. We're employing as many sources of knowledge as possible, from global databases to local observations with free and open source tools exclusively. Knowledge created by PhDs coexists with knowledge created and practiced by local communities with varying degrees of formal education. We are not alone in our learning. Our teachers are not only humans. We are learning about the communities of plants in collaboration with other ecospheric studies like rain, climate, soils, rocks, and grazing animals. The tremendous potential of these forces is apparent as we work to document the diversity and use many forms of knowledge to gather the plants needed to build the landscape anew. We are documenting and conserving such plants in order to, with our colleagues at the Land Institute, and on a very, very, very small scale, begin to make selections of potentially useful plants. This is the beginning of some of this work. These are perennial chickpeas, which we actually brought back home to the Middle East from gene banks outside of the Middle East, and are growing out. This are medicagos, also in our research plot, that are part of Brandon Schlottman's collection at the Land Institute. And this is Kernza, growing in Palestine. It's 3 small rows. Most of the plants survive the first dry season. We're not sure what's going to happen next, but it is the first perennial grain crop in the land that produced the first annual grain crop. So it's happening. The wild relatives of many major crops persist on our landscape. Many plants that were not selected for domestication millennia ago, many of which some Palestinians still rely upon, could become domesticated crops within new polycultures. Such polycultures of perennial grain and cover crops could emerge within existing the perennial infrastructure. We like to think of the grapes and the olives, which are still very much going strong in Palestine, as a kind of infrastructure which we could use for perennial polycultures to increase the diversity. So we have this infrastructure of olive, almond, grapes, and other fruit and nut crops, which we hope to work on. So our vision is that a new perennial landscape is possible through co-productive research between local communities and technical experts via free and open technology and tools. So we seek to make these new cultural institutions and make this a reality.
An honest social perennial vision is of a hotter and less predictable and lonelier world that, nevertheless, still is a planet persisting in lively, beautiful movement. That is still the ecosphere in which seeds can sprout and roots can grow. That is still that critical zone for soil retention and formation. That is still that creative nexus for the continuance of diverse communities enduring in landscapes. Communities whose behavior shows that they have learned and that they are still learning across generations. We can imagine new agricultural logics that would be both ecologically enacted and socially performed. These logics would carry us forward on the path of perennialization, which, as we've said, is also necessarily a path of diversification. Here, you might picture more of the migratory movement of a river versus a single road. These new agricultural logics would invite and reward generative relationships instead of extractive domination. They would depend upon the reasoning that all humans need to give their time and bodies and attention to the moral support and the needs of all other humans, as well as non-human creatures, and the places and processes of the ecosphere. And they would seek to learn and make rather than destroy and improve. They would see farming, as Wendell Berry has written, as the proper use and care of an immeasurable gift. So we might name these as logics of responsibility, of sufficiency, of mutuality, curiosity, beauty. Or we might try to say something in very simple words that's actually incredibly complicated, that such agricultural logics would be common sense if our economy was actually in ecosphere. Just as agriculture is not external to us, a social perennial vision is not merely visible, like something out there, like some sort of sight on a horizon. Instead, I think that, and we think that it's in here, among and between us, and we think that a social perennial vision is deeply sensible. So thank you very much.
That was just beautiful. Thank you. I want to ask a question. It shifts the emotional tone, but maybe the emotional tone can carry a hard question. And that is, Palestine is a settler colony in another phase in the 20th century. It's not the last phase. It's happening elsewhere. And I think when we think about landscapes, it might be a good case. So I'll just ask you, I haven't thought of this before, to think about the division of land into separate plots, which is, I don't know if it's prior to or coterminous with annual farming. But I think you see where I'm going. So I won't extend the question. Well, let me extend it.
I think I know.
Yeah, real estate everywhere
Yeah.
is a serious problem, and it's urban and it's rural, and the two are connected. And we have a lot of trouble thinking our way out of it to a landscape. What would a landscape organization look like in terms of not property probably, but some alternative form of governance?
Should we take... Okay. Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence. I'll try to be very brief, but I don't think it's a coincidence that the place that gave rise to annual grain-based agriculture is also one of the most important sites for territorial conflict in the world, and one of the most intense investments in securitization and border control and obsession with tenure, and I hope that it's not a precursor to what the rest of the world will look like as resources diminish. I really hope that that's not the case. I fear that it might give us some insights into where things can go. But at the same time, I also don't want to say that Palestine is just this, disaster case that where nothing is happening. I grew up in the States, but being in Palestine, I'm just shocked by the diversity of plants that the earth gives every year. Brandon is a legume scientist, and the plants that he studies were just coming out of the sidewalk and out of the walls, and they're coming all over the place. You stand anywhere you're standing on like 12 species of medicagos and vetches and things. So it gives. It's an amazing landscape which gives a lot, despite the destruction.
Help imagine or build?
Unfortunately, not at this time. Previous iterations there had been, but.
That was awesome. Thanks very much. So I have a question for your thoughts on this. So agriculture is the world's largest and most rapidly expanding ecosystem, and it's also the leading cause of biodiversity loss. And I wonder what your views are on our collective vision for a perennial future in terms of its role to not only renew the soil and our agricultural ecosystems, but also to help contribute to this other major global challenge of biodiversity conservation.
Maybe I'll just build upon what was mentioned in the last panel about the need for a variety of efforts in a variety of places, and a recognition of not only what has been in places historically in the past, but what is still persisting in some traces and in some very small pockets. When I think, for instance, about my work in ethnobotany, I think about how a common perception of that is as the study of what people used to know about plants, and is now preserved only in the archives. That has not been my experience. And in fact, I wrote a dissertation about how indigenous authors are reclaiming and reappropriating that type of knowledge, not only in literary forms, but also in material forms and practices. So I think that the work of resurgent and reclaiming cultural and biological diversity might be linked here. And the ability to build institutions and communities that value that knowledge are part of the vision that I think that we would have. And so there is, I think, a lot of mental agility required in moving back and forth from all these different scales of the planetary and continental down to the regional and local and back and forth again. But to me, that is also the kind of acuity that's needed and agility that's needed to make these connections between the social and ecological. So when I think about biodiversity, I'm also thinking about that connection to human forms. Do you want to add on?
I think that's great.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this visionary talk. If I understood you correctly, you kind of linked the transition to perennial agriculture to a whole change in communities, in human communities, in the way societies act and live together. I was wondering if that is correct and how, optimistic you are that this transition would happen, and what should happen first, or does that need to go hand in hand to make the perennial revolution successful?
Go for it.
I think one of the things that no one knows, but I think it's not necessarily deterministic. We can't just necessarily have some tools or some new plants and then assume that everything is going to be great. But at the same time, I think the last panel, for me, we were just kind of talking to each other during the last panel, because it was so clear that we all feel that working in our local area, whether it's plant breeding, that there won't be a kind of universal blanket, and that to me has to do with rural communities as well. It has to do with labor across Europe, across many parts of the world, across the United States, and across the state where I grew up in Iowa. Rural communities are diminishing, and I think part of some of the major debates that are happening today in politics have to do with these kinds of dynamics of rural and urban, and a sense of disempowerment and disenfranchisement of many rural people. And I think that it's not a quick fix. It's not a button. But I think when this research is conducted in a way that rural communities are co-producing, and many local communities are co-producing the knowledge to the extent that it's possible. There are obviously needs for very technical and specialized knowledge, but many of these knowledges exist. The last thing I'll say is that the main source for the book, for the guide that we produced, is actually a very, very hardworking smallholder farmer. She's not a hunter-gatherer, She's a farmer, but she knows hundreds of plants that you can eat in the spring. So I don't think that the knowledge is necessarily, mutually exclusive, and it's part of this community. And since then, in that village, people now have an interest more in these plants, which we need to conserve and protect at the same time we're using them, of course. But
yeah, I would just maybe confirm and affirm that I do think that human community behavior needs to change along with the development of new tools and technologies, and in relationship with those for the ultimate vision that is ongoing to actually come to fruition. And I think that there is no reason to think that we fully understand the way the human community functions. We've paid a lot of attention to what it means to change minds individually, but I think that there is a lot of knowledge to be applied in different fields, especially out of educational research and theory, to thinking about how you can draw forth and lead out new human communities. There's a lot that we don't know a lot about past communities, and I don't think there's any reason to believe, maybe to badly use a metaphor or analogy from breeding, I don't think there's any reason that it's theoretically impossible to change human community behavior in the ways that we want.
So we are at the close of our time here, and I know we all have so much to talk about here. What an thought-provoking conversation that you all have opened. But I'm going to pass off to Leonard to give us some closing words this afternoon.
If anybody thought that this was just about another crop, I think you have been convinced that it is not. It is a major transformation that we are thinking of. And my experience is from leading a 10-year interdisciplinary Linnaeus Center here at Lund University. Throughout that, the 10-year period, I think that we have packed more true interdisciplinary into this afternoon that we managed to do over the 10 years. And I think what is so important is that here we have geneticists, biotechnologists, soil scientists, ecologists, sociologists, philosophers. They all speak to each other. Of course, we don't understand everything. I don't understand very little about the diploids and the tetraploids and so forth. But we still talk to each other. And that is an extremely promising sign. So if somebody would like to here at Lund University or in Sweden or in the Öresund region would like to know more about this, we have created a kind of consortium which consists of people at Lund University, myself as the coordinator, the Swedish Agricultural University at Alnarp, where Erik is the coordinator, Erik Sten Jensen, up there, Professor of Agroecology, and Anna Westerberg, Swedish, the SLU at Uppsala, and the Land Institute, Tim Cruz. So there is a homepage coming up very soon about this sort of emerging consortium, research consortium. And as you see, many people can take part of it, even if you don't understand what the difference between a diploid and a tetraploid is. And I think back to Wes Jackson's vision some 45 years ago, he said that this will take at least 50 years, but we can perhaps do it within 100 years. And we are coming close to that lower limit, he said. And I think it's fair to say, Wes, that your guesses, we are probably much closer to the 50 years than the 100 years. I think even you have been surprised by the speed of the science in the last half decade, perhaps. And with this trajectory, I think there is a real chance that we can see a real change out in the landscape within the next decade or so. If we ask people, if we were able to ask people who lived, let's say, 150 years ago, who were toiling in factories, if we ask them, so, are you part of the Industrial Revolution? They would probably not say, no, yes, I am part of the Industrial Revolution. It's only in hindsight we say, they were part of the Industrial Revolution, without knowing it. Maybe in 2049, when people sit in seminar rooms like this, they will say, you remember that meeting in Lund in 2019? That was one of the key components of the perennial revolution. That's my hope. And you should feel part of it. So thank you for coming.